Well, hello guys, welcome to the setup video. Now, no Myron in this video, no real pilot. This is probably the only video where a real pilot will not appear because this is all simulator stuff. And obviously a real pilot can't really help us with this because we have to figure this out for ourselves. So the idea of this video is just to show you some of the things that you can use in your sim or use outside of your sim to enhance your use and your enjoyment of the PMDG 777. Now, a lot of the stuff that I'm going to show you and talk about is applicable to other aeroplanes as well. So if you have the PMDG 737 or the Majestic Q400 or really any airliner that involves some flight planning, some of the stuff that we're going to show you here is going to be applicable. So you may well find this is quite a useful video to come back to. Now, first of all, let's talk about the flight simulator itself. Now, there's a good chance if you've bought this that you've bought this because you're flying the PMDG 777. But let's not forget there is an alternative version of the 777, and it's called the Flight Factor 777 Professional, and it's available for X-Plane. Now, X-Plane is an alternative platform. It works on a Mac, it works on Linux, I say Linux, maybe it's Linux, and it's something that I don't have a huge amount of experience with. X-Plane is a really interesting platform, and as of the time of me recording this, there is a new version of X-Plane called X-Plane 11, which is the beta version, which has just been released, and it really does look interesting. Certainly at night, the immersion of X-Plane is absolutely mind-blowing. Certainly out of the box, it absolutely blows away FSX and Prepare 3D. It blows them into the dirt. But there are some problems with X-Plane as it stands. One is there's not an enormous amount of content for it. So whereas every aeroplane you can imagine is simulated in the FSX and prepared world, there really aren't that many what you would call study level sims. So, sims that require you to watch a training program for them, for example. There's really only a handful of those for X-Plane right now. And the 777, I have to say, is not as good as much as it looks good, and it kind of works. It is not as well-rounded as a sim as the PMDG one. So if you're watching this because you're flying the 777 in X-Plane, a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about you will find useful and you will find applicable, but this course is predominantly aimed at people flying in FSX and prepared. However, X-Plane is certainly one to watch because a lot of interesting stuff seems to be coming down the track for X-Plane in the future. So, with X-Plane out of the way, let's have a look at the other two platforms that you may well be using. Now, Prepared is the most, if you like, current platform, and I'm going to come back to that one in a moment. Let's talk about FSX because Microsoft Flight Simulator is kind of where it all began. Desktop simulation, in a way, kind of began with Microsoft Flight Simulator, and over the years the sim has been expanded, and it started out as just a few dots on the screen, and over time it's evolved into FS98, which was the first one that I ever flew, and then FS2000, which introduced Concorde, FS2002, which brought in add-on ATC and some add-on scenery, and then FS2004, Century Flight, which is where I got really interested personally in flight simulation. And then finally in 2006, 2007, we saw the launch of the final ever Microsoft flight franchise, if you like, ignoring the fact they brought Microsoft Flight out a little bit later, but we'll come back to that. FSX was the last kind of big release from Microsoft for flight simulator fans, and it was a big deal. It was advertised. There was a TV advert for it, which you may remember. It was advertised in the shops. You could pick it up with your groceries when you went shopping, and it was a pretty big deal at the time. And FSX has kind of stuck with us, and the reason that FSX has not really gone anywhere is because Microsoft kind of stopped developing. Apparently, so goes the story, and I don't know whether this is true or not, but apparently Bill Gates was a bit of a closet flight simmer, and he had a personal interest in the sim. And as soon as Bill Gates stepped down from Microsoft in the kind of late 2000s, a different direction was taken, and sadly Microsoft closed down the flight simulator studio. So that was kind of the end of flight simulator development. So basically what this means is that, a bit like a James Bond film where a new one comes along every few years, sadly, flight simulator development stopped in 2007. So it would be probably a little bit like, Pierce Brosnan still being James Bond. You couldn't really imagine that now, could you? So if you're flying FSX, what are your options? Well, there is a boxed version of FSX. Obviously, this is the one that we all bought back in 2006. They don't make it anymore, so it's quite hard to get hold of, and they do end up on Amazon or eBay for ridiculous amounts of money sometimes. If you really insist on still flying Flight Simulator X, then you need to go and find the Steam edition. The rights to Flight Simulator X were bought by a company called Dovetail, who are famous for their rail simulator, and they have kind of pre-packaged it and offered it in an online downloadable format from Steam. Now, Steam is a website where you can download games, and it's very simple. It's one click. You kind of click install, and it installs the whole thing onto your PC. You don't have to put discs in. You don't have to go around the internet chasing updates and things like that. It will all just happen at the push of a button. So I could definitely recommend, if you insist on using Flight Simulator X still, then get it from Steam. Now, what's the difference between Flight Simulator X and this more modern platform that you may hear people talking about called Prepare 3D? Okay, well, the story is that Microsoft, I think, I don't know whether they leased it or they bought it or bought the rights, but who knows? Lockheed Martin, who are the defense contractor who make missiles and military airplanes and other things, they bought the code to Flight Simulator X effectively, and they went off and remade it, and they rebadged their version as Prepare 3D, and they've continued to develop it. So unlike Microsoft, who just kind of parked it in 2007, the Lockheed Martin guys have been working continuously on updating Prepare 3D. And that means that every 2 or 3 months an update comes along, and every couple of years a big update comes along. And we are currently, as of the time I'm writing this, we are on Prepared version 3.4. I think. And what that means is that every couple of months an update will come along, and you have to reinstall what's called the installer package. It normally leaves all your scenery intact. It updates some things in the background, and every update that comes along fixes things and improves things and makes things a little bit better. So the big question is from you, why do I need to ditch FSX to go to Prepared? Well, you don't, is the easy answer. If you're happy with FSX, if everything's installed and it's running, then that's great. There's no reason to change. The reason you might want to consider changing is that Prepared has a lot more ability to deal with scenery and aeroplanes and complex situations than FSX. And the reason for that is simply that the code has over time been updated. Now, what that means is that FSX will struggle. So you can see here a screenshot of the 777 approaching New York. We're doing the RNP approach into Newark here, which is going to form part of the Cadet Plus flight, the one right at the very end of the 777 training course. And you can do this flight in Prepared because they've programmed it to handle memory a little bit better. Remember, of course, is that every time you load stuff up in your sim, it uses memory. So, for example, here flying into New York, all of these buildings, the Empire State Building, you can see there in the distance, they are all using memory from your computer. Now, because FSX and Prepared are based on kind of quite old legacy code, they are limited to what you call 32 bits. So it doesn't matter how much RAM you have in your computer, physical RAM that's fitted, the program can only access a limited amount of that. And once you start loading up complicated cities, complicated aeroplanes, complicated scenarios with weather, all that stuff will start eating away at the amount of memory the program can use. Eventually you will get the nightmare of all flight simulators, which is called out of memory. And you'll see this because your computer will flash up this thing. It will say, your computer has run out of memory. Please close the sim. And this will always happen. It never ever happens right at the beginning. It always happens right at the end of a flight, just as you're about to come into land, having flown right across the Atlantic, and you're about to ace that approach into JFK, and your computer runs out of memory. So one way to stop that happening is to move into Prepared. Another couple of reasons to maybe move into Prepared is that the visuals simply look, in my opinion, better. You have cloud shadows. There are shadows generated onto the sea. The water looks better. The ground textures look better. There's a lot more control over how it looks, certainly visually prepared once it's up and running, especially on a pretty powerful machine. Absolutely blows away FSX in terms of the visual look. So to be honest, in 2016, if you have a good computer and you're a pretty committed flight simulator fan, I'm really struggling to see why you would continue to stick with FSX. The big bonus of FSX is it's kind of finished and it doesn't change and it's not really being updated anymore. So if you've got it up and running and working, maybe you're the kind of person that really doesn't like to fiddle. Once you've got it working, then you're happy. Then I can understand why you might want to stick with it. But if you've got a good PC, if you've got a powerful graphics processing unit, then it probably is time to start thinking about prepared. All of the scenery that you have pretty much for FSX will work in prepared. All of the aeroplanes that you have for FSX will work in prepared. One exception though is that the PMDG 777, which is the aeroplane that we're looking at now, you will have to purchase that again, and it's quite a lot more expensive for prepared than it is for FSX. There are lots of reasons for that, and you can go and Google them at your heart's content, and I'm not here to get involved in that conversation, but you will, I'm afraid, need to buy it again. Okay, so we've talked about the two different sims. What about actually running them and making them look good? The holy grail, if you like, of flight simulator enthusiasts is a thing called the frame rate. Now, what is a frame rate? Well, the frame rate is quite simply the amount of times that the information is drawn on the screen. And the best way to understand this is to go back and look at some old films, maybe old cowboy films or films that were made 100 or more years ago. And you'll notice in any of these films that people seem to run even though they're walking. When you watch anyone, they walk in a really odd fashion. It's almost like the video is kind of speeded up. And the reason for this is because these really old films were actually recorded with a very low frame rate. Now, what that means is that somebody would walk across the frame from left to right, and the camera would only catch maybe one frame every few seconds. So if you walk from one side of the room to another, you might actually maybe walk a whole step in between the camera capturing that frame. And what that means is that when you played that film back, you would then walk in a rather jerky fashion because half of the movements of your legs as you walked across the room were actually lost. So the way to get around this is that those old filmmakers used to speed up the film to try and make it look smooth again, and that's the reason why everyone in an old film looks like they're running everywhere. Now, the reason that they did this is because film was very expensive, it had a habit of catching fire, and they really wanted as little film around as possible. So that's the reason that old films were filmed with a really low frame rate. The point I'm trying to make to you is that this is applicable to us in the modern sim world because we kind of have the same issue. We want more frames because more frames makes the picture look more smooth. The problem is, of course, that we then run into the limits of what our hardware can do. Remember, a modern flight simulator has to create the whole world. It has to create the weather, it has to create the aeroplane, it has to create the scenery, and it has an awful lot of work to do. And of course, it isn't going to be able to do that at 100 frames, 200 frames per second. It's only going to be able to do it. Even a really good modern PC is only going to be able to do that at maybe 30 frames per second in a very demanding situation. So, to understand how frame rates affect what we see on the screen, we also need to understand something called the refresh rate. Now, the refresh rate is basically how many times the lines on your screen refresh themselves. And we can actually see this is a clip of a TV that's slowed down. And what you're actually seeing here is the refresh in action. So you're actually seeing every second or so, bearing in mind that this happens 60 times a second in real life, but this film is slowed down. What you're actually seeing here is the vertical lines of the TV screen refreshing themselves. This is what's happening, but it's happening so fast that our eyes can't actually see it. Now, the frame rate and the refresh rate work together, and the way they work together is a bit like this. So your computer screen almost certainly 99% of the computer monitors on the planet refresh at 60 hertz. That's 60 times a second. So every one of these pink boxes represents, if you like, the refresh time of your computer monitor. Now, along the bottom here is what's happening with your flight simulator. And as you can see, this flight simulator is only running at 24 frames a second. But the same would be true if it was running at 32 frames a second or 33, or if it was running at 21 or 26, anything other than 60. What you're seeing here is that they're not quite in sync. And if we kind of zoom in, what you can actually see here is that the refresh rate is happening along the top and the frame rates are happening along the bottom. And what you can actually see is that the screen is refreshing, one refresh, two refresh. On the third refresh, we're halfway through a frame. And what that means is because the frame rate has become unsynchronized with the refresh rate, we're going to get a stutter, because what will happen here is your computer monitor will try to refresh half of a frame, and half of a frame it can't do, and that will show as a stutter. Now, there is a solution to this, which is keeping your computer refresh rate in sync with your monitor. The way that we do this is with a thing called NVIDIA Inspector. Now, NVIDIA Inspector is a little app you can download. Just Google it and you can find it and you can run it. And I'm going to show you how to do this with FSX. Now, FSX is called, in this particular program, Microsoft Flight Simulator 10. Don't ask me why. And you'll see a setting here which is called half refresh rate. Now, what the half refresh rate setting will do is it will limit your gameplay to half the refresh rate of your monitor. So if your monitor is a 60 hertz monitor, which almost certainly it is, it will force the game to run at 30 frames per second. Now, the beauty of this situation is that now, rather than having the frames and the refresh rate of your screen going out of sync, so you're getting a frame in the middle of a refresh, they will be perfectly in sync. If your sim can achieve 30 frames a second, then this is how you want to run it. Now, we run into another little problem here with Prepared, in that this particular function, this half refresh rate tweak, has been disabled in Prepare 3D by Lockheed Martin. So the only way that you can now fix this problem is a rather drastic solution, which is actually to change your monitor. Now, I'm running an AOC monitor, and as you can see, if I jump into my NVIDIA control panel settings here, you can actually see my resolution, which is 380 by 2160, so that's 4K resolution, and I'm actually running at a refresh rate of 30 hertz. And as you can see, there is the mouse moves around perfectly. Some people say 30 hertz is too low a refresh rate for a computer monitor. I use it all day long. I edit on this using 30 hertz. There's absolutely no problem at all. And in fact, if I change it to 60 hertz and press apply, give it a couple of seconds, the screen will go blank. If I say yes, you can see that perhaps the mouse does move around a tiny bit quicker, but I'll be honest with you, I really cannot tell any difference whatsoever. And the beauty of running your monitor at 30 hertz is that now, running at 30 hertz, your simulator is perfectly in sync with the refresh rate of your monitor. So your sim is running at 30 frames per second and your monitor is running at 30 hertz. So in other words, the frame rate and the refresh rate are perfectly in sync. And if you're completely confused about this and you haven't got a clue what I'm talking about, then the proof is in the pudding. Go and have a look at Rob Ainscough. There he is with his racing car, and check out Rob's channel. Rob actually has a bunch of videos. They are all shot using 30 hertz and they look absolutely fantastic. He shoots them all at 4K. He shoots them all using 30 hertz, and he shows you how it works. I mean, he shows you how to set it up. He shows you everything. Please do check out Rob's channel. There's one particular here, which is the 30 hertz motion test, where he's actually, and in fact, if I just full screen this, you can actually see it all. And look at that. So you're now watching a kind of capture of a YouTube video that I'm just playing out straight from YouTube, and look how smooth that is. There's no lags, there's no tearing, there's no stutters. It just looks fantastic. And the reason it looks so smooth is because Rob is running a 30 hertz monitor. His frame rate is perfectly in sync with the refresh rate of his monitor, and that's what's being captured, and that's why it looks so good. So there you go. 30 hertz is the future. It's what I'm running now, and check out Rob's channel. Rob's a great guy, and there's lots of really cool videos on his YouTube channel. We have talked about setting up your sim. We have talked about how you get your sim looking good. So we've talked about the merits of the different sims. FSX is kind of yesterday's news. Prepared is the new modern one, but you do need to make sure that your refresh rate and your sim are in sync, and we've showed you how to do that by going out and getting yourself a 30 hertz monitor. Are there any tweaks that you need to do beyond that? Well, actually, for prepared, no. You can go into the config. The config, by the way, in case you're wondering where this lives, it lives in C, users, and then the name of your computer, application data, roaming, Lockheed Martin, prepared v3, and in this thing here called prepared. And in here, there's a bunch of things that you can change. The advice these days generally is not to play with this. I don't think I've actually changed anything in here. I think this is pretty much bog standard as it comes out. In FSX, in the old days, you had to go in here, and there were things that you could change and fiddle around with. You really don't need to do that anymore. You can pretty much just run it as it comes out the box these days. So you've got prepared running. You're up and running with your sim. Now, how do you start making your sim look absolutely fantastic? Well, that's the next part, and we'll talk about that next. So welcome to the second part of this video. This is where we're going to look at some of the utilities that you can use in your sim. Now, the first thing, and probably one of the most important things, is the textures that install into the sim. Now, obviously, when you load up your sim, you have a load of what they call default textures. Now, default textures are the ones that were shipped by Microsoft or by Lockheed Martin if you're flying Prepare 3D. What you have now is the ability to tweak these with some add-on programs. And to be honest with you, kind of a year ago, this was pretty simple to do because there weren't really that many of them. The big one, the one that really everyone got very excited about, is this one here, which is called Rex 4. By the way, you'll notice I'm running this as an administrator. I always tend to do that. If you see this little shield icon over the top of a program in Windows, it generally means that it wants to run, or it needs to be run as an administrator. So just make sure that you do. You can right click and tick run as administrator always, but it's just a kind of habit of mine. It's in, where is it? It's in compatibility, isn't it? Run program as administrator, but I always forget. I just generally right click and hit run as administrator. It's just it's a thing I do. So this is Rex 4 Texture Direct, and as it says on the tin, this is going to replace the default textures inside your sim for the clouds, the sky colors, the sun effects, and the water. It will change the airport lighting for default airports. This doesn't affect add-on airports, by the way. Add-on airports will use their own set of textures for this. But if you've got default airports, it will change the signs and the parking stands and surface reflection and stuff like that. To be honest, I never ever fly to default airports, so I literally have never actually even played with this section. But let's have a look at the important bits. First of all, clouds. Very important. People are desperate for nice looking clouds in the sim. And for a very long time, Rex was the kind of gold standard of clouds. That Rex clouds looked really, really good. And to be honest, they still do. I still use Rex in my sim. And something that came along a little bit after the original Rex program was this program here, and I'm going to run this one. I don't know whether it'll let me run both at the same time, but we'll wait and see. Oh, yes, it will. Okay, so this is called Rex Soft Clouds, and what this is it was a kind of updated version of the cloud program, except that instead of your clouds being, well, hard, they suddenly were soft, and you can actually see the difference if I kind of pull this to one side and kind of pull that there. This, by the way, is only the low-level clouds. This is not the high-level clouds, doesn't change. It's the low-level clouds that are the same. So whereas you can see in the screenshots, you kind of get these big, kind of big clouds that look like cauliflowers. The soft clouds are more kind of wispy, I suppose you might say, kind of softer and maybe less defined. Now, some people really like soft clouds, and certainly I found in FSX they looked absolutely brilliant. I don't, and this is just my opinion, I don't find they work quite as well in Prepared, and I don't quite know the reason why. What I do know is that Lockheed Martin changed the way the clouds are generated in Prepare 3D, and for some reason, for me, the soft clouds don't often look that great. They often look very flat, and they're just not so good. So my personal opinion is don't use soft clouds in Prepare 3D. That's just my opinion, and it's just the way that I do it. What I actually use is this one here, which is set to, which is Stratocumulus pellucidus. That's actually the one that I use in the sim, and it's quite nice because you get those nice big fluffy clouds, but you also get the small wispy ones as well. For me, it gives a good kind of mix of both. It's just the one that I use. Again, this is only my opinion on what looks good to me. You might load this into your sim and think it looks absolutely rubbish. It's entirely up to you. So that's low-level clouds. Mid-level clouds, I mean, these are all kind of the same, really. These are kind of wispy, kind of stratus clouds that you get generally a bit higher up. And a lot of them look the same. Just going to pick one. Wispy Cirrus would probably work quite well. And stick that in your sim and see what you think. I mean, this, you just have to kind of experiment and see what you think. The other thing is sky colors. So how this works is it will change the colors of the sky at different times of the day. So this is Sky Dawn, and you can see that you can have a real kind of proper dramatic kind of waking up in Death Valley kind of sunrise. Or you can have something that's a little bit more muted. So if you live in Europe, you're probably more likely to see something like this. And again, it just kind of depends. Depends where you live, depends what you want to see. If you want to go for the more dramatic ones, then go for it. If you want something a little bit more sober. And it's the same kind of thing with the daytime sky colors as well. Now, the only thing I would say is that having showed this to some of our pilot team, they seem to think that the more subtle ones are more realistic. So like this one, which is called Polluted Environment, which has the sky not a very kind of bright blue, it's almost a kind of a polluted blue, or maybe this one, which is maybe a little bit bluer, or Shannock. These are the more kind of realistic ones. Again, it just kind of depends. You know, Ibiza, it looks great, and on screenshots looks fantastic, but does the sky really quite look that color? I'm not entirely sure. Again, this is just going to be something that you're going to have to experiment with. Some of them will look better than others. And then the same thing for the dusk. Again, it all depends on where you live. If you live somewhere warm and sunny, you may well see a sunset like this, or if you live in Nevada, you might see this. If you live in Europe, you're probably more likely to see something like this, like Frankfurt when it's chilly. So that's the sky colors. Again, it's kind of up to you, and it's the same with the sun. Do you want a kind of small sun, or do you want a kind of big washed out sun? Just kind of pick one and load it up. Same with the water. It's kind of up to you. The one bit of feedback that I had for my real pilots on this is that the dark colors, having fiddled around with a few, the dark colors seem to be a bit more realistic to what you might see in real life. So it's kind of up to you. Load it up and away you go. Airports, I don't fly from default airports, so it makes no difference to me. But again, you can choose the runway lighting based on bright or not so bright or whatever you want to do if you fly from default airports, which you probably don't, to be fair. So there you go. That is Rex. And you also have some more options as well now. Since Rex came along, there is Envitex, which is a new one, and I've not even had a chance to try this one out yet, but there are some people who say it's really, really good. And also there is one called Active Sky Cloud Art. Now, let's talk about Active Sky for a moment. Active Sky are better known for their weather generator. Now, let me talk about the weather generator first, and then I'll tell you about Asker. Now, the weather that you get in the sim is not very good. It tends to kind of uniformly set the weather, or you get big kind of jumps from one weather station to another. The way that the weather works in the sim is that as you fly along, the sim will download the weather for a weather station along your route. So as you fly away from one weather station towards another one, the sim will change the weather to match the weather station that you're flying towards, and as you fly over it to the next one, it will change it again. What you can sometimes get is big shifts in weather. So suddenly it's cloudy and raining, and then the next minute the clouds vanish and the rain goes and the sun comes out. Now, obviously that can happen in real life, but it's pretty unusual to go from kind of summer to winter in the same flight. So the beauty of an application like Active Sky is that it does a lot of very clever things with the weather. It downloads the real weather and kind of injects it into the sim, and it does it dynamically and a bit more slowly and cleverly, and there's lots of things going on that I don't really understand. What I can tell you though is that the easiest way to run this, unless you always fly with the current time, is just to click this button here. And I didn't even know this button existed until maybe last year. Just click Force Historical Time to Sim Time, and what it will do is it will download the weather for the time that the sim is in. So the great thing about this is that if you want to go back in time and fly in a hurricane that was a year ago, you can load up your sim, choose the time from a year ago, and as long as this button is pressed, it will simply pull down the weather from that time and load it into the sim. So this way, your sim weather will always be completely in sync with the time of the sim. And this basically just saves you having to change it. So if you load up the sim with the current time, you will effectively have live weather. If you load up the sim 2 weeks ago, you'll have the weather from 2 weeks ago. It's a great button. Force historical time to sim time. A couple of other things that you might want to have a look at, and again, it's probably going into a little bit too much detail for this, but you can turn some stuff off. I tend to turn off the sim messages so you don't have stuff popping up in the sim, because that can affect your performance actually if you have messages being drawn in the sim. If my wife is asleep and I don't want her to shout at me, I turn off this one, which is called Thunder Sounds. When you start this application, it sounds like a huge thunderclap, so I turn that one off because it can be quite loud. A couple of other things I do as well, I actually turn the visibility down a little bit. Upper visibility, the default value is 199. This is the maximum upper visibility. I actually have this kind of way down here at about 75. And what this tends to do is it kind of pulls the horizon in, so you can't actually see as far. And my pilots tell me that that is quite realistic. It's pretty unusual. You would need a very, very clear day for you to be able to see kind of 200 miles. It's just you know, a long way. I have always traditionally in Active Sky pulled the upper visibility down to below. It used to be 100. I've always used it around the 75 miles point, because it would need to be an exceptionally clear day for you to be able to see 200 miles at altitude. So I tend to pull it down, and it's what works for me. And you see less of the horizon, you see less of the scenery being generated in the distance, and it kind of works for me. Again, your mileage may vary. It's kind of up to you. One other thing that you might want to look at as well, and this is PMDG advice, is that turbulence in the sim can sometimes upset add-on aeroplanes. It upsets the auto throttle, it upsets the autopilot, and if you have maybe the Majestic Q400, that particularly does not like lots of turbulence being generated by the sim. It gets very uncomfortable, and it's not very realistic. What I generally do is I actually lower this down. I've actually halved the wind turbulence, and the turbulence effect, I've halved that as well, from 70 to 35, and that works pretty well for me. Again, your mileage may vary. One other thing as well that I just want to show you real quick is that you can lock the ATC wind. This one actually forces there to be a minimum surface wind in the same direction at the departure and the destination. And the beauty of this is that if you sit and plan a flight and then the wind shifts around in real life, the AI aeroplanes that are taxiing around you at the airport can start using the wrong runway. So you might have done all your planning, and then suddenly they're using the wrong runway. And the same on the arrival as well, that they kind of change their mind about which runway they're going to use. the beauty of this selection is that it will force that kind of surface wind, a steady surface wind in the right direction, and you and the AI will all be using the same runway, which is what you get in real life. It's just overcoming a simulator shortcoming, which is pretty good. One other thing as well, I normally check this. I don't know why it's unchecked. Maybe my wife's been playing Flight Simulator. Prevent downloads on approach. And what that does is it stops, as it says, surprising weather changes during this level of flight. And you also find as well that if it downloads and updates the weather during the approach, it can affect your performance a little bit as well. So what this is doing is it's just stopping stuff happening as you're on final approach when you don't really want your sim doing other stuff in the background. One final thing that you can do with Active Sky is you can actually load up a flight plan, and they do advise you to load up a flight plan because it works better. If it knows where you're going and where you're flying, then it works better. So I'm going to import a flight plan. You can import flight plans from FSX or a flight plan that you made in SimBrief or PFPX that we'll talk about in a minute. So I'm going to load one here. This is one of the flights from the training program, which is Doha to Dulles. Don't think there's an alternate in this flight plan, so I'm going to put one in manually of Philadelphia, which is KPHL. I think that's Philadelphia. And what it will do now is it will generate the weather at all of the waypoints along this route. And if we click this button here called Briefing, this is pretty cool. It will surmise all of the weather into a kind of a briefing, and it will show the weather at each point. So in Doha at the moment, it's pretty cold for the Middle East, for the desert right now, 19 degrees. And then it will give us the weather at all the different waypoints en route. Obviously, most of those are at altitude, so they're pretty cold. And then one really useful thing, and again, this is something that I didn't notice till not very long ago, is it will give us the candidate runway for landing based on the wind. So it will give you the most favorable runways. So these are the runways that the AI is most likely going to be using. Gives you a bit of a heads up while you're doing your planning, which is 0-1 center, 0-1 left, 0-1 right, and 3-0. And as you can see, it's a pretty windy day. It's 290 17, gusting to 35. So it's not a particularly great day to be flying in Dulles. And then it will give you the winds and the temperature all the way through the flight, which is quite a useful thing to have. So there you go. So that is Active Sky. Now, what the Active Sky guys have done is that they have also come up with their own texture generation program, which is called ASCA, which is called Active Sky Cloud Art. And unlike Rex, which gives you the same textures all around the world, regardless of the weather, what ASCA can quite cleverly do is it can actually change the cloud and the sky textures based on the weather. So if it's a really horrible, miserable day and it's pouring down with rain, it will give you quite kind of grey, dull ones. If it's a beautiful, warm day and you're flying in the Australian outback, it will give you really bright, vibrant ones. That's the idea. I haven't really tried ASCA enough to give you an opinion on it. I did try it for a little bit. Personally, I preferred the clouds from Rex, and I'm using Rex again. I'll probably come back and use ASCA another time. So there you go. So that is weather, and that is texture generation in the sim. There's a little bit more to go with this as well, that if you're using P3D, there's a thing here which is called P3D Tweak Assistant. Now, P3D Tweak Assistant, try saying that after a couple of whiskeys, is a thing that can add kind of haze, and it can change the lighting, and it can change the way that fog is generated and the water. And there's a bunch of stuff that is far, far too clever for me to even explain it to you. But as you can see, there's lots of different options here where you can fiddle around with it. The best advice I can give you, unless you really like fiddling with these things, and I don't, I like to find one that works and then install it and forget about it. I'm actually using a preset made by a chap called Predrag Dropback, who I think is from Eastern Europe somewhere, and he's quite a clever guy. He's a bit of an expert with this, and if you join the Prepare 3D group on Facebook, that you can join, and if you join that group, then all the files to download are there. and there's lots of different ones. There's a guy called Pierre who made one. I tweaked his and didn't like it and ended up using Predrags again. And there's lots of different things. Every week a new preset comes out for you to fiddle around with, but certainly P3D Tweak Assistant is something that has absolutely transformed the look of P3D, and the best thing about it is it's absolutely free. By the way, the Tweak Assistant, this is not textures, it's not sky textures or cloud or anything. All this is doing is it's just changing the settings inside of P3D. So things that you can't actually change in the settings, it's basically tweaking the shaders, which are the things that kind of create the shadows and everything else. This is tweaking that. So for example, the granularity of the water surface, whatever that is, this is adjusting it by a value of 2. So I'm sure if, oh, there you go. There's the low values mean more sharpness. The default P3D value is 3. So I've got that on 2. So my water is a little bit less sharp than the P3D value. So there you go. Have a fiddle around with that to your heart's content. I can strongly recommend P3D Tweak Assistant. Okay, so we've talked about clouds, we've talked about weather, we've talked about textures, we've talked about P3D Tweak Assistant. Are there some other things that you need for your sim? Yes, there are, and we'll come to those in utilities next. So we've talked about the sims, we've talked about the look of the sim, we've talked about performance in the sim. Now let's talk about the actual hardware, what you're plugging into your sim, because hardware is pretty important. We know that a computer is obviously very important, and getting the right PC and the most powerful graphics card and the fastest CPU that you can get. But what about the stuff that you're actually touching, like your joystick or your throttles or your rudder pedals? Well, again, it's kind of up to you, and it depends on your budget. If I would strongly recommend that you get some rudder pedals. In the sim, it's so much easier if you can steer on the ground with your feet and it leaves your hands free. You've got to remember, in a real aeroplane, you can move your head around and you can see things out the window. In the sim, it's a bit harder than that, because unless you're using something like Track IR, which is quite good, but it's quite an expensive piece of kit and they are prone to breaking. I have used Track IR in the past, so I'm not including that in this bit because I don't actually use it anymore. The one thing that you've got to do is you've got to somehow move the viewpoint around. So maybe if you're taxiing out of an airport and you're going around a corner, in the real world, you would just look to your left or look to your right. In the sim, you've actually got to physically kind of move the viewpoint left and right at the same time. So you do tend to need lots of hands and feet and things at the same time. So one advantage of having rudder pedals is that you can steer the aeroplane on the ground with your feet, and that frees up your hands to change the viewpoint or do whatever you've got to do. The rudder pedals that I'm using are the Cytec ones. They work quite well. They have a spring on, so you can tighten them up and adjust them. And I've had them maybe a year or so, and they've lasted really well. In terms of a yoke, because of course you are flying a Boeing here, so you don't really want to be flying it with a joystick. You could really do with a yoke for the most kind of realistic feel. I'm actually using a really old CH Products yoke, and this is a great yoke. It's not particularly expensive. It's got a hat switch on the top, which I can use to kind of pan left and right. It's got plenty of buttons on that I can assign to gear and flaps and other things, and it kind of does what I want it to do. You've got to remember, in a 777, you're not really going to be flying the aeroplane a lot by hand, so you don't really need to spend a ton of money on a very expensive yoke. For me, if it came down to the Cytec yoke, which I've also had, or the CH yoke, I will go for the CH yoke every time, just because for me it actually feels a little bit sturdier. The problem with the Cytec one is that it has a spring in the middle which centers the yoke, so when you let go it tends to kind of spring back, and it can actually make hand flying quite difficult, because anytime you kind of relax the yoke tends to want to center. A real aeroplane does have a tendency to kind of roll back to wings level, but it's very slow, whereas the Cytec yoke kind of wants to kind of slam itself back to the center. I didn't really like it, to be honest with you. So for rudder pedals, I think the Cytec ones work really well, better than the CH ones, by the way. But for a yoke, for me, if you don't want to spend a lot of money and you want a decent yoke, then the CH yoke gets my vote. And there are a couple of different ones. There's the kind of the one with the bells and whistles on it, and it's got more buttons and things, but the basic one works absolutely fine. For a throttle, I have used lots of different throttles in the past. I've used the Cytec throttles, and they actually work pretty well. They are quite flimsy, and it's very easy to snap the actual throttle handles off. If you just walk past it and brush it, you can actually snap the throttles clean off. They're kind of made to a budget, and they do look and feel a bit like them. And the other thing that will happen with them over time is that they'll become loose, and then when they become loose, they tend to not respond very well. So as you kind of move the throttle up and down, you'll get lots of weird inputs into the sim. So that will drive you pretty batty fairly quickly. One throttle that I did kind of invest in this year, even though it doesn't really look like one from a commercial aeroplane, is this one. It's the X56 Rhino from Cytec. I have the joystick as well. I don't actually use the joystick because I'm only flying airplanes with a yoke at the moment, but it's two separate units. You get a joystick and you get the throttle, and the throttle's really good. It's heavy, it's very smooth. There's a ton of buttons on the front. It also has adjustable buttons which you can use as a separate axis. So if I'm flying, for example, the Q400, I can actually assign the prop levers to these, which is quite nice. It saves you having another unit on the desk. And it has a nice big solid button on the top that I use for reverse thrust. So I actually set up in FSUI PC, which is another little app. And if you want a great video on this, go and check out Frugal on YouTube. He has an amazing video on setting up FSUI PC. And what I will do is in the members area of the Airline to Sim website, I will actually put a quick little guide as to how to set up reverse thrust, because it can be a little bit fiddly sometimes, setting up reverse thrust with FSUI PC. But this throttle is really good for that. It has a big button on the top, and you just kind of mash it, and that brings out the reverses. Sometimes reverse can be quite difficult to do with simulator hardware because the throttle has to be fully retarded before the reverse thrust will work. And if the throttle isn't, and sometimes with pretty cheap kind of simulator hardware joysticks, the sim doesn't register that the throttle is now fully retarded, and it won't allow you to extend the reverse thrust, and that's really annoying. But this one, it seems to work every time, so I can heartily recommend it. So the Rhino from Cytec is a great throttle, has everything that you need on it. CH Products yoke works perfectly for me, and the Cytec rudder pedals work really, really well for pedals. And to be honest with you, that's it. Once you've got a mouse, you've got a decent, maybe a gaming mouse with a few buttons that you can configure on it, and a keyboard, then you are pretty much, in hardware terms, good to go. So we talked about hardware. What are the other must-have things for your sim? Let's talk about flight planning. Now, you're going to see us in the next video with Myron plan a flight from San Francisco to Boston using a website called SimBrief. Now, SimBrief is an online website you can go to, and you'll see how that works, and I'm not going to talk any more about that because there's a whole video coming next. One other way that you can plan your flights is using this thing here, which is called PFPX, and PFPX stands for Professional Flight Planner X. And essentially, if you've ever woken up in the middle of the night and you've been dreaming about that moment when you became a flight planner and dispatcher, then this is the program for you. You can plan flights to your heart's content with this one. It literally has absolutely everything to do with flight planning. You can tweak every single aspect of it. You can add alternates. You can look at the alternate weather. You can plan ETOPS flights. You can validate the flight plan. You can just go absolutely dispatcher crazy with this program. Now, the only drawback I find with this program personally is just that it does take quite a bit of getting your head around. It's quite complex, and there's quite a lot to dispatching flights, and a lot of it I'm not really interested enough in it to really want to know how it works properly. I didn't really wake up in the middle of the night dreaming about being a flight dispatcher, so maybe it's just me. But we will be looking at this particular program later in the cadet training. We're going to be taking a big long flight from the Middle East to the USA, and we will be using PFPX to plan that flight because a longer flight, there's an awful lot more to consider. However, if I was planning a pretty short flight and I wasn't using ETOPS and things like that, I would probably just use SimBrief. But this is a good one to have, and once you've got it, it's kind of yours forever. You do need to make sure that the database is updated, and as you can see here, the nav data is a little bit out of date, and in fact, I'm going to update that now. So that brings us to our next app that is really, really important for your flight simming needs. One is this one, which is Navigraph Charts. Now, there are a couple of different options for charts. Different people provide them and make them and sell them. Some of them are better than others. My personal choice is this one, which is Navigraph. I like their layout and I like the charts manager. So you can pretty much download the charts for any airport in the world, any major airport anyway. So let's say we want to go to Kabul in Afghanistan. I'm not entirely sure why we'd want to do that, but just humour me, it's right at the top here. So you actually see the airport charts vanish off into the download manager, and then when they are populated, they appear here on the left hand side. Now, these are real charts. These are not kind of pretend charts. They're not charts that have been made up by someone in the room. These are actual Lufthansa systems. Lido is a Lufthansa kind of group company, and these are the charts that they make. So Lufthansa obviously use these. The whole of the Lufthansa group use these, and lots of other airlines around the world do as well. Emirates use them, and other people. So these are the actual real charts. I mean, I've seen the real charts for my pilots, and they are these charts. They are identical. The only difference that you sometimes find is that airlines will sometimes have another couple of pages that are made by Lido specifically for their airline. So as well as the charts that you see here, they actually have about 4 or 5 separate charts which are specific to the airline and give cautions to the crews about, I mean, Afghanistan, Kabul is a particularly difficult airport to operate to because there's mountains and there's people who want to shoot you, and there's an awful lot of things to consider about operating to Kabul, and they will include these in their charts. So we don't get those, but what we do get is all the rest, and these are real charts. So the SIDs are here, the stars, and if you're not someone who understands charts, I know that a lot of people in the flight sim will kind of struggle with charts because they don't really understand them, and it's all a bit kind of gobbledygook. The thing is with charts that once you understand how a chart works, once you understand how one chart works, then you can probably pretty much work out every other chart in the world. They're all kind of laid out the same way, and these particular charts, the Lido charts, I find really clear because they're in color. And once you kind of understand what you're doing with the chart, then it all begins to make a bit more sense. And we will be using charts extensively through the 777 cadet training program. You can't fly without charts. A real pilot would not even leave the ground without a set of charts. It's crucial that you have them, and my personal favorites are these ones from Navigraph. So get the charts so that you can follow along with what we're doing in the training program. The other thing that you need to make sure is that your navigation data is up to date in your aeroplanes and all the other applications that the sim uses. So this is Navigraph's FMS data manager. Now, what this is doing is it's scanning my computer to see what I have installed in terms of aeroplanes, in terms of applications that use navigational data, and it's seeing if I want to update them. And you can actually see here that I've got Active Sky for P3D. I've got the IXEG Classic, which is an X-plane aeroplane. I've got the Majestic Dash 8. I've got PFPX that I just showed you a moment ago. I've got the PMDG products, 737 and the 777. I've got the Quality Wings 146. I have Top Cat, which is a performance calculator that we'll talk about in a moment. And then obviously some X-plane things here. This is what it's found on my hard drive, and it's saying, hey, do you want to update these? Now, what is nav data and why do you need to update it? Well, it's pretty simple, really. In the real world, the procedures that are used to fly in and out of airports sometimes change. So it might be that maybe there's an approach procedure to a particular airport, and the people that live near the airport keep complaining to the airport and saying, hey, we've got airplanes flying over our heads all day long. We're bored of it now. You need to change the approach so that the airplanes, fly a few miles to the left or a few miles to the right. So what will happen is that approach will be updated. And then every month, the new procedures are distributed amongst the airlines all the aeroplanes get updated, and the aeroplane, when it goes to fly that procedure, will fly the new procedure. And these change all the time. So you may well find that if you're using old charts, you may well find that that particular approach, so you might go, right, I've got an old chart here, I'm going to try and plug this in the aeroplane. You may well find that it doesn't exist anymore because it's now gone. So it's kind of important that A, you have the latest charts, but you also have the latest FMS data, because the two kind of go hand in hand. The charts and the FMS data need to be the same. You need to have the latest charts to make sure that you've got the latest charts, and you need the latest FMS data because you've got the latest charts. They need to go hand in hand and go in sync. So this is what we're doing here, and you can actually see that because I've been so busy editing the 777 training, I've not had time to update my settings. So what I do is very simple. I can just click select all and hit update, and you can see now that the little spinning wheel will go around, and what it's now doing is it's now updating all of these applications. So Active Sky is now being updated to the latest one, and then once that little spinning wheel has finished, then that means it's updated. And then the IXEG 737 will be the next one to go when that one has finished, and then so on and so on. And you can now see that that's changed to green, and that shows that we're now running the latest what they call revision. So we're at the moment currently on the IRAC cycle, which is what they call it. The latest set of FMS data is 1613, and as you can see at the moment I'm one behind, so that is going to update itself, and in a short while that will be updated and we'll have the latest data. This is a must-have. With Navigraph you can actually buy the charts and the data, and I think you can pay, I can't remember off the top of my head, it's less than €10 a month for everything, and it's well worth having. So I would heartily recommend that. So that's the Navigraph FMS Data Manager. That's what you do. Okay, so let's talk about scenery in the sim. Now, we've talked about replacing the textures for the sky and the sun and the clouds and the sea. But what about the land? Obviously, this is the important bit, because when we take off on land, we're going to see the towns and the cities and the villages and the countryside. We want that to look good, right? Well, the best way to do that, and there are other people that make this kind of thing, but the thing that I like and works for me and many other people is the stuff which is made by Orbix. And this is their program that installs when you load stuff up into your sim. This is what you get. And as you can see, I've opened up their little control panel here, which is called FTX Central. I think FTX stands for Full Terrain X. And as you can see, there's a couple of updates available because I haven't obviously opened this up for a little while. And I have a variety of different products which are made by Orbix, all of which are enhancing the sim in some way. Now, some of them are pretty simple. So for example, along the bottom here, I've got 3 different airports. One is Dubrovnik Airport, which is in Croatia, which is a fantastic rendition of that airport. Very challenging to fly into because of where it is. Palm Springs International over in the USA, and also Stockholm Arlanda in Sweden. They are just add-on airports. Very simple. You download them, press install, and it replaces the default airport inside the sim with an incredibly complex and attractive looking new version. Above that, we have the things that really change the sim. Now, these are game changers for the sim. I would not install and run and fire the sim without these, and some of them are a bit easier to explain than others, so bear with me. I'm no expert on this, but I'll give it a go. First of all is global trees. Now all this does is it replaces the trees with kind of HD versions in the sim, and they just look much better. You can see from the screenshots that they actually look like trees, as opposed to the ones in the sim, which often don't really look like trees at all. They look a bit more like lollipops. So if you want nice trees, I can definitely recommend this one. The next one is called Open Land Class. Now, to install this, you kind of need this one, which is called FTX Global Base. Now, again, to cut a very long story short, what this does is it replaces all of the default textures inside the sim. So all of the stuff that was shipped by Microsoft by default, it is it's replacing. So for example, here's a screenshot of a city, and you can see all of the houses and the roofs and the buildings and everything, and you can see the vegetation in the background and the trees and everything else on the roads. All of this has been replaced from the default sim. So the default sim textures have been overwritten, if you like, with these new ones, and these just look much better. This is not a cheap add-on. In fact, it's probably one of the most expensive add-ons around. As you can see at the moment, it is on a sale. Again, I would not fly with our FTX global base. It replaces all of the default textures and looks absolutely fantastic. It gives you night lighting, which is 3D. I'm a big fan. It's really, really good stuff. Next thing that you get or can get, which kind of works hand in hand with that, is this one, which is called Open Land Class. Now, this one is specific to Europe. There's also a North American one available as well. I have the Europe one because I'm flying in Europe mostly, and it just gives you more depth and texture to what's called the land class. Now, the land class inside the sim is how the sim draws different parts of the land class. Now, if you think about Europe, it's a big area. My understanding is that this covers Europe all the way into, I think, Turkey. Now, if you imagine the terrain between somewhere like Turkey and somewhere like Great Britain or Ireland, it's going to be very different. Or the terrain in, say, Spain or Portugal. You know, the south of Spain is really far south. It's down in North Africa. So that's going to look very different to the kind of highland glens of Scotland. And what this program is doing, what this particular add-on is doing, is trying to recreate this more accurately inside the sim. And again, this is a bit of a game changer. Open Land Class Europe, definitely worth the money. And then finally, the one thing that you really want to get from these Orbix guys is this one, which is called FTX Global Vector. And what this does is it draws the coastlines properly. One thing that you will find in the default sim is that the coastlines will just kind of finish. And what this does is it aims to kind of draw them a bit more accurately, draw water a bit more accurately, draw roads a bit more accurately, draw roundabouts, golf courses, bridges, tunnels, that kind of thing, tram lines, railway lines. It will just try and draw them all more accurately in the sim. And again, it's definitely something that is worth having. There is a bit of a performance hit with Vector, and one thing that it will do is increase your memory usage. Remember, we talked about that right at the beginning of this video. One thing that Vector will do is use a little bit more memory, so you're going to need quite a powerful PC if you want to run Vector as well. So there you go. They're the three biggies from Orbix, which is FTX Global, Open Land Class, HD Trees, and Vector. So I'm a big fan of Orbix. If you want really good scenery for the sim, it's a good place to go. Other places that you can look out, scenery that I recommend, stuff made by Flightbeam, and you will see San Francisco and you will see Dulles in the training videos that are coming in the program. Anything made by Fly Tampa, you will see their version of Dubai in the training program. Taxi to Gate are a newer team. They make Hong Kong and Munich and also Doha, all of which are going to be used in this program as well. So Fly Tampa, Flightbeam, Taxi to Gate, Orbix, all these are really good makers of scenery for the sim, and I can recommend all of them. Now, we're nearly coming to the end of the things that you need to run your sim video. A couple of other things that you need. One is something that people have a bit of a love-hate relationship with, and this is called Easy Camera or Easy Dock. Now, I'm not going to kind of show you how it runs in the sim. And the reason I'm not going to do that is because if you go to Frugal's channel, Frugal is a well-known YouTuber in the flight sim world. He's made a brilliant video on how to set up EasyDock, so you really don't need me to do it. In the members area, in the download section, we will actually have the 777 camera file, and all you need to do is just kind of import that into your sim and it will work. You don't really need to know anything more than that. The reason people have a bit of a love-hate relationship with EasyDock is that it was kind of released and everyone loved it and everyone bought it, and then kind of development on it stopped and people had to try and find ways to make it work with newer versions of the sim, and everyone got a little bit frustrated with EasyDock, and I think it's a real shame because it's actually one of my favorite applications for the sim. I think it works brilliantly. It adds so much immersion to be able to kind of move around in the flight deck, and it adds camera shake, and as you go down the runway, the camera shakes up and down. I love EasyDock, but there is a new kid on the block which is called Chase Plane. Now, I've only used the Chase Plane beta so far, and I really rather like it. I like the look of it, and I like the interface, and it feels like EasyDock, dragged kicking and screaming into the 21st century. It is still in beta, so I haven't used it any more than that. We don't use beta products in our training videos just because it puts the stress levels quite high if they don't work. So I can't tell you any more about Chase Plane than it looks very, very promising. But for now, I'm still using EasyDock, and if you want to go and check out Frugal's video on how to set it up, it's actually pretty simple. It looks quite scary. People get a bit intimidated by it. But to be honest, once you've installed it and once you've imported a set of... The complicated thing with EasyDock is when you start trying to fiddle around creating your own cameras and fiddling around creating world cameras and stuff. If you just import an existing set of cameras, it's actually pretty simple. So EasyDock is a must-have. You must have a camera application, and EasyDock is still the one that I recommend until Chase Plane comes along with its finalized product, which I don't think will be too far away. So I think by now you've got a pretty good idea of what you need to make your sim look good, run well, and the most important things that you need in order to be able to make your sim work. To fly the 777, there's kind of one more thing that you're going to need, and that thing is called performance. Now, when we get into the training, we will talk about why performance is important in an aeroplane, because the pilots need to know how much runway the aeroplane's going to use when we trundle down the runway to take off. Now, in the sim, it's quite difficult to actually get hold of performance. In a real aeroplane, they normally have this on a laptop or an iPad, and in the sim, we have to kind of make do with a couple of different applications that are available to us. And what I want to show you is a bit of a unique thing. I've actually managed to get hold of, through a friend of a friend, a screenshot of a real Boeing, what they call onboard performance tool, and I'm going to compare that with the two applications that we can get for the sim. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a takeoff performance calculation, and we're going to compare the results of the real thing with what we have in the sim, and then on that you can kind of go off and make up your own mind. Okay, so the last thing that we need to talk about, and this is something that you kind of need to know before we go off and do the training, is about takeoff performance. Now, I'm not going to talk through what takeoff performance is, because we talk about it in training, and we talk about V1 and V-rotate and V2 and what all these things mean and the significance of it. What you need to kind of know at this point is how we've arrived at those figures and how in the sim we can actually go away and calculate these speeds. Now, in the real aeroplane, they have this on what's called an OPT, which is an onboard performance tool, and normally it's on a laptop or an iPad, and the crews get the weights, and what they do is they punch in the weights into this program on the iPad or the laptop, and it will then spit out the performance figures for the aeroplane. Now, it's very important that the crew have performance figures, because obviously they need to know how heavy the aeroplane is, because the heavier it is, the more runway it will use when it takes off. And obviously if you're taking off from a runway that's fairly short, then that becomes quite critical, because what we don't want to do is run out of runway before we're in the air. And that's the whole reason that we do takeoff performance, and we'll talk about that in the training in more detail. What we need to do now, though, as part of our setup video, is learn how we get these figures before we go flying. And in the real aeroplane, obviously there's the onboard performance tool, or they get it from the dispatcher and it's sent through the ACARS, which is a kind of satellite uplink into the aeroplane. Now, obviously, in the sim world, we don't have that luxury, so we are restricted to a couple of different applications or programs that can do this for us. Now, Airline to Sim, we already own a performance calculator, but sadly, it's for the wrong aeroplane. It's for the Dash 8 Q400, so that's not really going to help us here. So we kind of have two other options. There's one called TopCat. Now, TopCat's pretty good. They make performance calculators for the 737, the A320, and a bunch of other add-ons. They also have a kind of beta profile for the 777, and they've kind of said, hey, look, it's a beta profile. It's not quite perfected. It's not quite finished yet, but, you know, hey, it should work. So what I thought we might do is we might have a look at a screenshot from a real onboard performance calculator and compare that with the ones in the sim, and from that we should be able to figure out how accurate they are. And it also is quite interesting to see how the real one works. So here it is. Here's a screenshot of a real performance tool. Now this is looking at a takeoff from Dublin, EIDW. It's going off runway 28. The conditions dry, the wind's 200 at 8 knots, and the outside air temperature is 9. QNH is 1031. The flaps are set to optimum, so in other words, the program will choose the flap setting for the takeoff. The AC is on auto, so that normally means that it's on. The engine and wing anti-ice is off. The CFG is full, and the takeoff mode is TO, which is just takeoff. In other words, we're not using a derated takeoff mode. Now, we will talk a bit more about that in the training. If you're thinking, oh, what, I don't really quite understand CG and I don't really understand TO, don't worry, all that will become clear in the actual training program itself. What we're really looking at here is just the figures that it's spitting out and see actually how accurate they are. So you can see that it's spat out a bunch of figures. It's saying 5 on the flap, so that's the flap selection that it wants us to use, and then the V-speeds on the right hand side there. And then on the left hand side you can see it's giving us another couple of figures that are quite important here. One is the selected temperature, which is 59 degrees Celsius, and then the N1 setting. And very simply, all that means is that the N1 setting of 87.6, that is how much takeoff thrust the auto throttle is going to apply. Now, obviously, the shorter the runway or the more challenging the conditions, then the more takeoff power we need. If, for example, this flight, which is from Dublin, and actually taking off at a fairly low weight, this is obviously a pretty short flight for a 777, and obviously in this situation it's quite happy to use a fairly low thrust setting to save some fuel and save the airline some money. Now, the selected temperature, 59, again, we'll talk about this in the program. We'll flesh out exactly what this thing is about, using a temperature to calculate takeoff performance. Again, we'll come back to that in the training. All we're looking at here is just what kind of figures. Remember, this is the real one. This is the real thing. So why don't we plug these figures into our flight simulator version and see what kind of figures it comes up with. So the first one that we're going to try is this one here, which is called TopCat. Now, nothing to do with the cartoon cat or anything like that. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to use exactly the same parameters to calculate it and see whether this comes up with similar figures or not. So we've got the right runway. We've got Dublin, EIDW runway 28. Let's just change the wind, because the wind is a little bit different to our real world example. 9 degrees is correct. 1031. The runway is dry, and need to adjust the takeoff weight a little bit. 247998, and I think everything else is the same. The thrust config is takeoff, the air conditioning is on, the anti-ice is off and auto. So actually, let me change the flaps to optimum, because that's saying optimum, and let's hit compute. Okay, there we go. So what it's saying is that it wants to use flaps 15, which is obviously different to the real one, and the speeds are not quite the same. The speeds are going to be different because the flap config is different. Let me try it with flaps 5 and see if it gets any closer. Okay, well now actually you can see the speeds are a lot closer. So the real one is saying V1 at 152. This is saying V1 at 147, which is a little bit off. but then the speeds sort themselves out a bit later. So the rotate 151 is very close, and the V2 is actually identical to the real aeroplane. The two things that are pretty different though is the N1 setting. This is the amount of power it will set for takeoff. It's saying 92.5, which is quite a bit more than the real one, but the thing that's quite a long way off is the assumed temperature figure here, which is 48 degrees. That's kind of 10 degrees below the real one, and if you actually set 48 degrees in the real aeroplane, I don't think you would get 92% N1. I think you would find it would be significantly lower than that. So what we know is that the real one is a real figure. Just plug that into the airplane, that's what you'll get. In this kind of beta version of TopCat, clearly some of the figures are a little bit off, so we would have to treat these figures with caution. Clearly this N1 figure is not that far away, 92% versus 87.6 for the real one, but we would have to really treat this assumed temperature with caution, because it's kind of 10 degrees below, and if we plug this into the airplane and to try to take off, we may well run into trouble, because we're not going to be producing the engine power that we want. We would need to be pretty careful with that. Let's try the other one. This is called Topper. Now, as you can see, Topper is very clearly based on the real one. It looks just like it. So, you know, hopes are high that maybe this is going to be a little bit more accurate. So let's try this one. Then let's type in EIDW. Let's just make all these things the same. Runway 28. No intersection, because we're going to go full length. Condition is dry. The wind's 200 at 8 knots. The outside air temperature is 9. QNH 1031, and the takeoff weight 247998. Now you have to choose your own flap setting with this one. There's no optimum flap setting, so you've got to kind of pick one. So let's go with 5 and see what happens. Air conditioning is on. Anti-ice is it's kind of off engine or engine. There's no auto section here. This is a little bit simpler. And we need to be in the 200 LR. So let's calculate that and see what it comes up with. All right, so it's saying 156, 160, and 165, and the selected temperature is 56. All right, so we've kind of now got the opposite problem, that the selected temperature figure is a bit more accurate, 56 versus 59 in the real one, but you can see that the V speeds are some way out. The V1 is a bit higher, rotate is quite a lot higher, and the V2 is kind of 7 knots faster, which is quite a lot, really. So I think the moral of the story is that neither of them are particularly accurate. I mean, I suppose you might be able to say that perhaps the best combination is actually to use them both, because the assumed temperature from Topper seems to be fairly accurate, and the actual speeds calculated by TopCat seem to be accurate. So maybe what you should do is use Topper for the selected temperature, and then use the TopCat to actually get the selected speeds. So there you go. That's takeoff performance. It is what it is. I think the flight simulator world does definitely need a new takeoff performance calculator, because it appears that both of them are a little bit off the pace when it comes to accuracy against the real one. So there you go. That is takeoff performance. We talk about it a lot in the training, and it's important that we know how to do it. One thing that's worth bearing in mind, of course, is that you don't actually need to do takeoff performance in the PMDG 777, because the FMC will actually calculate it for you, but that calculation is not taking into account any winds or anything else. It's just looking at kind of standard day calculations for the weight that you're at, and other things. So it won't really take into account weather conditions and obstacle clearances and other long and boring and slightly dull things to do with takeoff performance. So important thing in the real aeroplane, it's something that we'll talk about, and at least now you see that there are a couple of options to go away and get your takeoff performance. Okay. That's it for the setup video. This is the simulator setup video where we talk about setting up your sim. There is another setup video which will appear at the end of the course, which talks very specifically about actually setting up your 777 inside the sim. You'll actually see that there are a ton of options for the 777 inside the sim, ways in which you can download the weather, the winds. There's an opportunity to look at the alternates which get downloaded as well, and there's lots of ways to set up your hardware to play with the auto throttles and everything else inside the sim. And we will have another video which will appear at the end of the cadet course. The final video in this course will be the setup video showing you actually how to set up your 777 to work nicely with your hardware, to work nicely with your PC, and also just some little tweaks you can make to make life easier operating the 777 in the sim. But that is enough setup. The next thing that we need to do is get our real pilot back and start planning some flights. So the flight plan video is next.